The first thing Arjun noticed was her hands. He had been coming to the Stellar Diner for 11 months, every Tuesday and Thursday, 6:15 in the evening, same corner booth because the seat faced the door and old habits from the army died slowly if at all. He knew every server by name. He knew that Priya took her smoke breaks at 6:40, and that old Marcus always refilled your coffee before you asked, and that the kitchen ran 5 minutes slow on Thursdays because the head cook coached youth soccer and came in late. He noticed things. He had always noticed things. But he had never noticed Jaya's hands shaking. She was Ventari, one of about 40 million who lived on Earth now, 11 years after the convergence. Her species was slender, gray-skinned, with eyes that caught light the way cats' eyes did, reflective and layered, capable of seeing spectra that humans couldn't name. She stood roughly 5'8", which was tall for her kind, and she had worked the Tuesday-Thursday shift at Stellar Diner for as long as Arjun had been coming. She knew his order without asking. Green tea, not black. Chicken rice soup. A small chocolate milk in a specific blue cup that his son Rohan had decided, at age 4, was the only acceptable vessel for chocolate milk in the entire restaurant. Rohan was 7 now. He was currently across the table from Arjun, coloring a picture of a starship with a red crayon. His tongue stuck out in concentration, completely unaware that the woman setting down his chocolate milk was trembling so hard that the liquid rippled in the cup. Arjun watched the ripples. Jaya set the cup down, straightened, and arranged her face into something neutral. The Ventari were not expressive by human standards. Their faces didn't move the way human faces moved. Emotion read differently on them, in the pitch of their secondary vocal resonance, in the dilation of those reflective eyes, in the angle of the small bony ridge that ran along their jawline. Arjun had never learned to read Ventari body language with any precision, but he had spent 4 years as a combat medic and 8 years as a father, and he recognized the physiological signature of controlled terror the way he recognized his own heartbeat. Something was wrong with Jaya. He had noticed small things about her over 11 months the way you notice things about anyone who was part of your routine. The way she hummed something under her breath when the diner was slow, a Ventari melody that had no analog in human music, built on intervals the ear couldn't quite follow. The way she always checked the door when she came out of the kitchen, not nervously but habitually, with the smooth scanning motion of someone who had trained themselves to do it without appearing to. The way she asked Rohan about his week, in a way that suggested she genuinely remembered what he had told her the previous week, and had thought about it in the interim. These were not server behaviors. These were person behaviors. He had filed them away, the way he filed away everything, without attaching a conclusion. Now the conclusion was attaching itself. "Is the chocolate milk okay?" she asked Rohan, and her voice was the voice she always used, warm, slightly musical, carrying that double-tone quality that the Ventari had, a lower resonance running beneath the words like a cello note under a melody. Rohan looked up from his starship. He considered the cup. He considered Jaya. "Your hands are shaking," he said. Children were honest in the way knives were honest, without malice, without mercy, without any interest in softening the truth. Jaya went very still. Arjun set down his spoon. "Rohan, why don't you see if you can finish coloring the engine compartment while I talk to Jaya for a second?" "Is she in trouble?" Rohan asked. "I don't know yet." This was one of the things about having a 7-year-old who was also your best friend. They didn't accept deflection. Rohan looked at Jaya again, then back at his father, then nodded with the gravity of someone who understood that some conversations were for grown-ups and that the best contribution he could make was to stay out of the way. He bent back over his coloring. Arjun slid over to make room in the booth and looked at Jaya. "Sit down," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. She looked at the seat. She looked at the other tables. Old Marcus was at the counter. Priya was in the back. The other 4 occupied tables were absorbed in their own evenings, a couple sharing a plate of fries, Two women who appeared to be having a tense but quiet disagreement about something involving a spreadsheet on a laptop. A teenager with enormous headphones who had not looked up from his phone in 40 minutes. Jaya sat down. For a moment she said nothing. Her hands were flat on the table, pressing down, and Arjun could see that she was pushing them against the surface to keep them from shaking, the way you pressed a wound to stop bleeding. He'd done that before too. Hands that wouldn't stop trembling after something you hadn't been able to stop. "I don't know who to tell," she said finally. "I have been trying to decide for 6 of your days, 6 days. I serve you your soup and your son's chocolate milk, and I think, tell him. And then I think, he cannot do anything. And then I think, it doesn't matter because I will be gone soon regardless." "Gone how?" Arjun asked. She looked at him. "Not gone like leaving," her eyes said. "Gone like erased." He kept his voice even. "The army had been good for that. Tell me from the beginning." She had been a xenobiological analyst before she came to Earth. This was the first thing he hadn't known about her. Not a server who happened to be Ventari, but a scientist who had been a server for 3 years, because it was the only way to stay invisible. And invisibility had become necessary in a way that had crept up on her slowly, and then all at once, the way all catastrophic things did. She had worked for the Galactic Consistency Authority. The GCA was the body that governed interspecies relations in this arm of the Milky Way, 14 sentient species operating under a framework of laws and treaties that had been developing for roughly 600 years. Humans had been granted provisional status 11 years ago, which meant they were watched, evaluated, and not yet considered full members of galactic civilization. This was standard. It had taken the Ventari 300 years to achieve full membership. It had taken the Crethan species 450. What was not standard was what Jaya had found in the data archive 18 months ago. She spoke quietly, watching the table, and Arjun listened the way he had learned to listen when soldiers told him things they hadn't told anyone else, without interruption, without visible reaction, letting the words land and settle without rushing in to manage them. She had been running routine comparative analysis on species contact records, standard archival work, the kind that no one paid attention to because it was the bureaucratic backbone of GCA operations. Intake, classification, longitudinal tracking of provisional species. And in the longitudinal tracking data for humans, buried in a subindex that hadn't been formally reviewed in 9 years, she had found an assessment. Not a public assessment, not the kind of document that provisional species liaisons referenced in diplomatic meetings or that showed up in the interstellar news feeds that translated GCA policy for human audiences. An internal assessment, sealed, authored by a 7-member panel of senior GCA consistency arbiters, dated 8 months after humanity's first contact with Ventari explorers. The document was titled, in the GCA's formal language, a pre-resolution determination, which translated into human terms as a decision made before the official decision, the real decision, the one the public ratification vote was meant to rubber stamp. The pre-resolution determination for humanity had concluded that humans were a red-tier species. Arjun had been out of active service for 4 years, but he still knew how to process threat assessments fast. What does red tier mean? Jaya's hands pressed harder against the table. It means the GCA determined before any formal contact protocol was completed that humans posed an unacceptable integration risk, physiological volatility, neurological unpredictability, history of intraspecies, mass violence at scales and frequencies that exceeded the tolerance threshold for Tier 4 status. Which means what specifically? She looked at him directly for the first time since she had sat down, and her reflective eyes were very wide. The way eyes went wide when the thing behind them was something the body was trying to hold back. It means that humanity's provisional status was never intended to lead to full membership. It is a containment protocol, The GCA intended to allow 20 years of provisional status, during which human civilization would become dependent on GCA trade relationships and technological exchange, and then the determination would be activated. Full member species would be informed. Trade would be restructured. Humans would be reclassified. Reclassified as what? As a managed species, not members, not provisional, managed. Like the Death V of Sector 12, they had an activation 40 years ago. They have a GCA administrator now. They do not make decisions about their own planetary policy. Their resource allocation is determined by the authority. The soup had gone cold. Arjun didn't notice. You said 20 years of provisional status, he said. We've had 11. Yes. So we have 9 years. No. She shook her head slowly, and the motion looked heavier than it should have, the way a person shakes their head when what they're saying hurts them to say. That is why that is why. 3 weeks ago the panel convened again. I found the session record. The timeline has been accelerated. Humanity's technological development in the last 11 years has exceeded GCA projections by a factor of 3. The assessment panel voted to advance the activation. They believe if they wait the full 20 years, humanity will have developed independent FTL capability, and a managed reclassification will become significantly more difficult. How long do we have? 14 months. Rohan had finished the engine compartment of his starship. He was now adding small alien figures in the windows, which he did not label but which were, based on their round heads and stick limbs, probably people. Arjun watched his son add a tiny figure to the cockpit window. The figure had a rectangle in its hands, a book maybe, or a controller. Something a tiny person would hold. 14 months. He looked at Rohan for a long moment. At the careful way his son was adding another figure, this one taller, standing behind the first, with what appeared to be a crayon-rendered arm around the shorter figure's shoulder. A parent and child in a starship cockpit window. He had done 2 tours and come home. He had lost his wife to a disease that had no interest in fairness and had raised his son on his own for 2 years, and he had kept going, which was the only thing you could do and also the hardest thing. He understood, in a way that was not dramatic but simply structural, that some problems did not care whether you were ready for them. They arrived. You dealt with them. Or you didn't, and the cost of not dealing with them fell on someone else. He looked at Rohan's drawing. He looked at Jaya. Why are you telling me? He said. Why not? There are people for this. There are human representatives to the GCA. There are journalists who cover interstellar policy. There are entire organizations set up after the convergence specifically to handle exactly this kind of interspecies governance issue. Why a Tuesday-Thursday customer in a diner? She was quiet for a moment. The diner hummed around them, the kitchen, the low music from the speaker in the corner, the couple at the table by the window laughing at something on their phone. Because I have been trying to reach the human representative for 6 days, and I keep encountering GCA communication filters that I did not put there. Because the journalists I know who cover this beat have been receiving their story tips through a GCA press liaison for the last 3 years, I found the routing records. Because I am not supposed to exist anymore, Mr. Sharma. I am supposed to have been transferred to a remote station 8 months ago. The transfer documentation was filed. My quarters on the Ventari residential platform were released. But I was already here, already invisible, and the filing was bureaucratic enough that no one has physically confirmed it. She paused, and in the pause he heard the precise texture of how alone she had been for 8 months, in her server's apron, humming her untranslatable melody, setting down chocolate milk in blue cups and soup in white bowls, and watching a man read and think and act, every Tuesday, every Thursday, trying to decide whether he could carry something this heavy. Someone in the GCA knows I found the archive. They filed my transfer before I could be found and asked questions. If I surface through any official channel, I will be found. And when I am found, the archive I copied will be dismissed as fabricated. My assessments will be called those of a Ventari who has, perhaps, become too sympathetic to her subject species, too human. The last two words landed with a weight that Arjun understood was not an insult. She meant it as an explanation of exactly how her testimony would be discredited. Not too soft, not too emotional, specifically, too human, as if that were a contamination, a compromise of her scientific objectivity. He filed this away. The way they had framed it already told him something about how they thought of humanity, as a subject species, as a thing to be evaluated from a safe distance, as something that could rub off on you if you got too close. "But you told me," he said. "You were in the military," she said. "I checked, 4 years, combat medic. You received a commendation for extracting a 5-man unit from a hostile engagement without losing anyone, using field materials because your equipment had been destroyed. You have been raising your son alone since your wife died 2 years ago. Every Tuesday and Thursday you sit in this booth and you read about whatever problem is in front of you and you think, and when you have finished thinking you act." She looked at the table again. "I have watched you for 11 months. I do not know what you can do. I only know that you do not dismiss things, and I have run out of time to be careful." Arjun sat with this. Outside the diner window, the street was doing what streets did in the evening, filling up with people going home, dog walkers, a kid on a bicycle, the orange-brown last light of a Tuesday in October catching the storefronts at an angle that made everything look briefly golden. An ordinary street, an ordinary evening. Inside this booth, a terrified scientist from another world had just told him that humanity had 14 months before it was reclassified as a managed species by an interstellar governing body that had been planning this for over a decade. He thought about the 5-man extraction. The thing he remembered about it was not the commendation but the moment before the commendation, the moment when he had looked at what he had available and what he needed and understood that the gap between them was large but not absolute, that there was a seam, that every problem, even the ones that looked solid all the way through, had a seam somewhere. He thought about the geometry of this one. The GCA had power. The GCA had 14 centuries of institutional authority and interstellar trade leverage, and the kind of bureaucratic mass that absorbed individual challenges, the way an ocean absorbed thrown stones. It had prepositioned the communications channels, filtered the press liaisons, filed the administrative transfer that had erased Jaya from the system before anyone could ask her questions. But it had done all of this quietly, because the determination was sealed, because 12 member species didn't know, because a thing done in secret required the secret to remain intact. "You said you copied it," he said. "Where?" She reached into the pocket of her server's apron and set something on the table between them. It was a data crystal, roughly the size of his thumbnail. Pale blue, faceted, the kind of storage medium that looked nothing like any human technology, crystalline matrices aligned at the quantum level, the Ventari equivalent of several petabytes encoded in something the size of a chip of ice. It caught the restaurant light and scattered it in 7 directions, throwing small cold blue prisms across the table, across their hands, across Rohan's half-finished starship drawing. Arjun looked at it. He thought about a thing his father had told him once, when he was 8 years old and had discovered that the tree he had been climbing for 3 years was being cut down to make room for a parking structure. "You cannot stop a thing that is already decided," his father had said. "But sometimes you can make the deciding public. Public things cannot be unredressed. They can only be answered." "I know a journalist," he said. She shook her head. "I told you, the GCA press channels." "The GCA press channel. A woman I went to school with. She covers science and technology for an independent syndicate. She founded it herself 10 years ago, specifically because she kept running into what she called manufactured access problems at every major outlet she tried to work at. No GCA liaison. No official press credentials with the authority. She applied twice and was turned down both times, which she has always found suspicious, and I understand now why they turned her down. He paused. She is also the most stubborn person I have ever met, which is saying something because I have met several very stubborn people. Jaya looked at the crystal on the table between them. The blue light of it was very small in the warm amber of the diner, a cold star dropped into a warm room. If it becomes public, she said, the GCA will deny it. They will call it fabricated. They will say I am a disgruntled analyst who created the documents to advance some personal agenda. They will question my psychological assessments, my loyalty to the authority, my objectivity after 3 years of close contact with a subject species. They will. Yes, he said. They will do all of that, and it might work. I want to be honest with you about that. I don't know that it won't work. I don't know that publishing it is enough. He looked at her. But 14 months from now they were going to do this with no one watching and no one knowing and no human being on Earth or off it having any warning or any voice in it. If it's public, they have to do it while everyone is watching. And when everyone is watching, things change. The cost of doing something in the open is different from the cost of doing it in secret. They have to explain. They have to stand in front of 14 species, including the 12 who didn't know, and say out loud what they plan to do to humanity. And they have to say it knowing that every human alive knows, knowing that every Ventari and Threnchi and Velari knows, knowing that other provisional species are watching to see whether this is what membership in the GCA actually means for species that can't protect themselves. He looked at the crystal. They designed this to work in the dark. Let's see how it works in the light. Something shifted in her face. Not a human expression. He still couldn't read Ventari faces with any confidence, but something in the angle of her jaw, the slight relaxation around her eyes. Like a person who has been holding their breath for 6 days and has just remembered that exhaling is an option. Dada, said Rohan, I finished the starship. Can we get dessert? Her name was Leela Krishnamurthy, and she answered her phone on the second ring, because she always answered her phone on the second ring. A discipline she had imposed on herself 15 years ago on the theory that important calls rarely happen twice, and people who let phones ring to project busyness were idiots. Arjun, she said. Her voice had the particular flatness it got when she was trying not to let anticipation color her assessment. I need to see you tonight. A pause. How bad is it? He thought about this. Define bad. Another pause, shorter. I'll come to you. She arrived at the apartment at 8:30, after Rohan was asleep in his room with the small lamp on because he still didn't like the dark, carrying a laptop bag and the specific expression she wore when she suspected something was important but didn't want to let the suspicion make her careless. She was 41. Small and precise in her movements, with the kind of stillness that came from years of learning to listen, without letting your face tell people what you thought about what they were saying. She sat across the kitchen table from Arjun and Jaya, who had come with him because it had seemed inadvisable to let her spend the night alone in the apartment above the diner, not knowing whether the GCA had noticed that she wasn't on a remote station. On the drive over, she had sat in the back seat very quietly, watching the city through the window with those reflective eyes, and Arjun had found himself wondering what she saw when she looked at it. A city that was about to be told it had no future it could call its own, or a city that was about to be told it had a chance to fight for one. He wasn't sure there was a difference, practically speaking, but it felt like there was. Leela looked at the data crystal on the table. She looked at Jaya. She looked at Arjun. Start, she said. They started. Jaya translated the crystal's contents. There was a Ventari reader in her pocket, a small device that could interpret the crystalline matrix and display it in a form legible to standard GCA interface protocols. And Arjun's laptop had a translation application that rendered GCA standard into English with about a 92% accuracy, which was not perfect, but was enough. The documents came up on Leela's screen one by one. The pre-resolution determination. The panel composition. The votes: 9 in favor, 1 abstention, 4 members recused due to advisory roles in the original contact protocol. The longitudinal tracking data. The risk classification matrix with its color-coded tiers that ran from green through amber through red, as if the future of a civilization were a traffic signal. Leela read everything twice. She asked questions about the authentication markers on the documents, about Jaya's access credentials and their validity level within the GCA archive system, about the chain of custody from archive to crystal, and whether anyone else had handled the crystal or the reader. She did not express alarm. She did not perform excitement. She did not ask questions that were really just statements trying on interrogative clothing. She asked the questions she actually needed answered, and Arjun recognized this as the behavior of someone who understood the weight of what was in front of them and was not going to let the weight make them reckless. When she was done with the documents, she sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "If I publish this," she said, "they will come for the source." "Yes," said Jaya. "And they will try to discredit the documents." "Yes." "Is there any authenticating record outside the crystal? Any way to verify these independently, separate from the crystal itself, so that if they challenge the crystal's provenance we have a corroborating structure that doesn't depend on it?" Jaya reached into her pocket again and set a second object on the table. Smaller than the crystal, a thin chip, matte gray, with GCA seal markings along its edge, and a small indicator light that pulsed at irregular intervals, slow and faint. An access log chip. It records every time a document in the archive was accessed, including my access sessions. The log cannot be altered retroactively. It uses the Ventari temporal chain authentication system, which encodes a time-stamped hash at the moment of each entry that references the hash of the entry before it. To alter any record, you would have to alter every record after it, which would require breaking the authentication chain, which would be immediately visible to anyone running a standard integrity check. She paused. "It is the same system your human blockchain technology is based on. Your cryptographers figured it out independently about 40 years after we developed it. Your engineers were very pleased with themselves." Leela picked up the access log chip carefully, the way you handled things that were both fragile and important, not delicately, not with performance, just with appropriate attention. "So the access log independently confirms that this archive existed, that these documents were in it, and that they were accessed on the dates you're claiming," she said. "Yes. And the chip is in standard GCA format, which means a Ventari cryptographer at any institution with GCA technical accreditation could run the integrity check and verify it. Yes, they would not even need to know what the chip contains. The format and the authentication structure are verifiable by any qualified analyst." Leela set the chip down and looked at Arjun. "It'll take me 48 hours to verify what I can verify independently," she said. "I'll need access to the crystal and the chip. I'll need to get a Ventari language specialist to confirm the translations on several key passages. I want someone independent of your translation app. I'm also going to contact 2 GCA policy analysts who I know are not on any GCA press liaison lists. There are 3 analysts in my contact book who operate independently and have been trying to map anomalies in the provisional status framework for years. If they can confirm that the structure of this determination is consistent with known GCA internal procedures, they will recognize it," Jaya said. "These documents were drafted using standard GCA format. The classification headers, the panel composition protocols, the voting records, all of it is standard. The arbiters would not have thought to disguise them because they never imagined anyone would find them. They sealed them. They thought sealed was the same as hidden." "It usually is," Leela said, "until it isn't." She looked at Jaya for a moment. The risk to you doesn't go away when this is published. It may get worse in the short term. The GCA will know where the leak came from, your access records, even if they try to challenge the chip, will point to your credentials. Your protection is the public record, not anonymity. I know, said Jaya. I have contacts at the Human-Alien Civil Cooperation Organization. There are legal protections for GCA whistleblowers. They're not well tested because there haven't been many cases, and the ones that exist were mostly minor policy disputes, not something of this magnitude. But the legal structure exists. I can connect you to their attorneys before publication, so there's a formal protection framework around you when it goes live. Okay, said Jaya. And then, after a moment, when I left Vendhari Society to take this work, I was told that the GCA's function was to ensure that no species ever faced the galaxy alone, that the purpose of the framework was to protect. I believed this. She looked at the crystal on the table. I have thought about it often these past 18 months, whether I was naive, whether the framing was always a deception. She paused. I have decided that the framework can be what it claimed to be if the people inside it choose that, but only if someone tells the truth about what it is doing instead. Leela closed her laptop. She looked at the table, at the crystal, at the chip, at the quiet kitchen with the drawing Rohan had made of a starship that was still on the counter where Arjun had put it when they got home. Little figures in all the windows. 11 years ago, she said, I applied for GCA press credentials twice. Both times I was told that my publication didn't meet the threshold for access because we were too small and our readership wasn't sufficiently broad. She paused. We had 4 million subscribers. The threshold for press credentials was 100,000. I never understood why they turned us down. She looked at Arjun. I understand now. It took her 51 hours, not 48. She published at 6 a.m. on a Friday morning. By 6:15, her servers were experiencing traffic she had never seen before. By 8 a.m., 3 of the 14 GCA member species primary news networks had picked up the story and were running translations. By noon, the GCA press office had released a statement calling the documents fabricated and the sourcing questionable, which was the standard playbook for this kind of situation, and would have worked considerably better if Leela had not published the access log analysis alongside the documents, complete with independent authentication by a Vendhari cryptographer at the University of Edinburgh who had no GCA affiliation and had been given the chip blind, without context, and asked only to verify its integrity. The cryptographer's report was 2 paragraphs. The second paragraph said, the temporal chain authentication on this access log is intact. No alterations have been made to any record. The access sessions are genuine. By 3 p.m., the story was the only thing anyone was talking about. By 5 p.m., the human representative to the GCA had called for an emergency session of the full authority. Arjun watched this from the couch with Rohan, who was eating crackers and following the news coverage with the focused attention he brought to things that seemed important even if he didn't entirely understand why. He was 7. He understood more than people gave him credit for. He had understood, for instance, that something had shifted in his father after the conversation at the diner, some quality of focus that was different from ordinary focus, quieter, more deliberate, like a person who has identified the specific problem in front of them and is working it with all available resources. Are those the alien people who were going to be in charge of us? He asked at one point, watching a panel discussion where a GCA spokesperson was trying and failing to look composed, being asked the same 3 questions in different orders by a journalist who had clearly decided that composure was optional tonight. Something like that, Arjun said. But now they can't because everyone knows. That's the idea. Rohan considered this. He ate a cracker. Is Jaya okay? Jaya was in a hotel room that the Human-Alien Civil Cooperation legal team had arranged, with 2 attorneys and a level of anonymity that was temporary but functional. Her formal GCA whistleblower protection application had been filed at 6:01 a.m., 1 minute after publication, because Leela's syndicate had an attorney who had been preparing the paperwork since Wednesday night, working from a template and adapting it to the specific facts of the case, with the calm precision of someone who understood that when the story went live, there would be exactly no time to be unprepared. "She's okay," Arjun said. "Good." Rohan went back to watching the news, a beat. "Dada, the chocolate milk cup is still at the diner. We'll get it next Tuesday." "What if we don't go Tuesday?" "We'll go Tuesday." Rohan nodded, satisfied by this in the way that 7-year-olds could be satisfied by the routine continuation of ordinary things, even when the world was rearranging itself around them. Maybe especially then. Continuity was not nothing. The blue cup would be at the diner. Tuesday would come. The diner would be open. These were small facts, and they were the load-bearing walls of the structure of a life, and you didn't dismiss them just because larger facts were also present. Arjun watched the news coverage and thought about the seam. They had found it. Whether they had widened it enough remained to be seen. The emergency session of the GCA took 4 days to convene because 14 species in different star systems with different biological rhythms and communication lags required patience and scheduling. During those 4 days, a number of things happened. The GCA press office revised its statement twice. The second revision stopped using the word fabricated. 7 of the 14 GCA member species issued independent statements, not coordinated, not identical, each one reflecting the particular cultural and political framework of the species issuing it, shaped by thousands of years of their own histories with authority and transparency. And what happened when institutions decided they knew better than the beings they governed? But each statement contained, in some form, the same essential question. If this determination was made, when was the authority going to tell us? Because this was the thing that had not been immediately obvious when the story first broke, but became obvious in the days that followed. As more context emerged and more analysts weighed in, and more GCA policy documentation came to light in a kind of secondary archaeological dig sparked by Leela's publication. The other 12 member species, not the Ventari who had authored the determination and whose senior arbiters had signed it, not the Crethan, whose lead arbiter had been on the panel, the other 12 had not known. The pre-resolution determination had been authored by a subcommittee operating under a seal classification that 12 of the 14 member species had, according to their own legislative records, never authorized for this category of decision. The GCA had not just planned to reclassify humanity without asking humans. It had planned to do it without formally informing the majority of its own member species. This turned out to be a significant problem. The Threnchi, who were the most senior member species by length of membership, released a statement that was 2 sentences long, which was characteristic of them. "We were not informed of this process. We do not endorse this process." The Velari released a statement that was considerably longer and included a formal request for a review of the seal classification protocols used by GCA subcommittees, which was the kind of structural challenge that had been attempted before and failed, but had never before been attempted with this much evidence, and this much public attention, and this much concurrent support from other member species. The Velari had their own history with managed reclassification. Their third moon had been placed under something called a Development Guidance Protocol 400 years ago, which had lasted for 160 years before being overturned, and they had not forgotten what it looked like when governance became administration became control. On the 4th day, in a public session broadcast across the GCA communication network, the authority's chair arbiter, a Ventari, because the Ventari held the chair this cycle, which was one of the reasons the original subcommittee had been able to operate as it did, stated for the record that the pre-resolution determination for humanity was suspended pending full authority review, and that the provisional status timeline would not be advanced. This was not a complete victory. It was not a declaration of full membership or an apology or a structural guarantee that something like this couldn't happen again. It was a suspension, a pause, a thing put on hold while everyone figured out how to deal with the fact that it had happened at all, and what it meant about the institution that had allowed it to happen, and what would need to change so that it couldn't happen again, to humanity or to anyone else. But a pause was not 14 months. A pause was time. And time, Arjun had learned, was what you used to make things that seemed impossible into things that merely seemed very difficult. Leela called him that evening. He was in Rohan's room doing the bedtime thing, the reading, the glass of water, the negotiation about how many chapters constituted a reasonable stopping point, the specific way Rohan needed his blanket arranged, which had been the same since he was 3 and showed no signs of changing. He stepped into the hallway. Yeah. The Velari reform proposal has 6 co-sponsors, she said, as of an hour ago. What does that mean? It means there's a genuine procedural pathway to restructuring how the GCA can classify provisional species, not just for humans, for everyone who comes after. The Velari have been trying to get this kind of reform through for decades and they never had enough support. They have it now. A pause. The story is doing what stories do when they're true and told clearly. It's spreading in directions I didn't aim at. He stood in the hallway and listened to his son breathing in the next room, already asleep in the way children fell asleep. Suddenly, completely, without any of the managed transitions that adults needed. Leela, he said. Yeah. Good work. A pause longer this time. You too, she said, and tell the Ventari woman she picked the right booth. The full GCA review took 14 months, exactly as long as the original timeline had given humanity before managed reclassification. Arjun thought about this sometimes, the irony of the duration, the way the clock that had been counting down to something terrible ended up being the clock that counted up to something else. During those 14 months, the Velari's proposed reforms to the SEAL classification protocol passed by a margin of 10-4. The Threnchi seconded the motion in a statement that noted, in characteristically brief terms, that a body that governs by concealment eventually finds itself governing nothing at all. The senior arbiter who had chaired the original subcommittee resigned. 3 others followed. The Crethan arbiter who had abstained issued a public explanation of that abstention that was, diplomatically speaking, a very complicated document but which contained the sentence, I chose not to support the determination, but I also chose not to report it, and these 2 facts are not the same thing, and I have spent 14 months accounting for the difference. Humanity's provisional status was extended for 20 more years, not shortened, which some had hoped for, but extended on formally negotiated terms, with explicit membership criteria and a public timeline and a dispute resolution mechanism that had actual teeth, and with a provision that any pre-resolution determination affecting a provisional species required full authority notification, which meant 12 species who would notice if it was ever tried again, which meant the darkness the determination had been designed to operate in was gone. It was not everything. No one who had worked on it thought it was everything. Leela wrote a piece at the 14-month mark that laid out, clearly and without sentiment, what had been achieved and what hadn't, what remained vulnerable and what had been genuinely structurally changed, and what would need to be watched for in the decades ahead. Arjun read it on his phone sitting in the Tuesday-Thursday booth while Rohan colored and Jaya, who had been formally granted GCA whistleblower asylum status in month 6, which meant she could work wherever she chose to work, and had chosen to stay at the Stellar Diner, brought him his green tea without being asked. He set the phone down. He looked out the window at the street going about its evening business, ordinary and ongoing. People who mostly knew the shape of what had happened without knowing the weight of what had almost happened to them. The sealed documents, the pre-made decision, the quiet machinery of managed decline. They knew it the way people knew most large things, through headlines and summaries and the filtered understanding that came with events too large to hold all at once. Which was fine. You didn't need to hold the whole thing to understand that something had changed. Rohan had moved on from starships. He was drawing alien animals now, working his way systematically through every species documented in the xenobiological catalog he had found online. He drew them carefully and labeled them in his handwriting, which was better than it had been a year ago. "Dada," he said without looking up. "Yeah. When I grow up, can I go to the other planets?" Arjun thought about the pre-resolution determination. He thought about the access log chip and the temporal chain authentication and the Threnchi's two-sentence statement and Leela's coverage and the attorney who had filed Jaya's whistleblower application at 6:01 a.m. He thought about 14 months that had been one thing and became something else. He thought about a small blue data crystal scattering cold light across a diner table in October. He thought about a woman who had watched him for 11 months and decided that the one thing she knew about him was that he did not look away. "Yeah," he said, "you can go wherever you want to go." Rohan nodded, satisfied, and bent back over his drawing. The chocolate milk sat in its blue cup, untouched for now, waiting. Outside, the street was doing what streets did, being ordinary, continuing. Which was, when you thought about it, exactly what you fought for. On the morning after publication, Arjun got a call he hadn't expected. The number was a GCA diplomatic exchange line, the kind that showed up as a long string of digits with the GCA identifier prefix, which he recognized because Rohan had made him look it up once after seeing it on a news banner and asking what it meant. He answered it, because not answering seemed like the wrong move. The voice on the other end was Venthari. Male, he thought, though Venthari gender markers in voice were different enough from human ones that he wasn't certain. The double-tone quality of the species was there, that cello note under everything. The tone was measured in the way tones were measured when the person behind them was expending effort to keep them that way. "Mr. Sharma," the voice said, "my name is Assessor Delvi Ron. I am a senior member of the GCA Consistency Review Directorate. I am calling because you are listed in the source disclosure documentation as the human intermediary who facilitated the publication of certain GCA archival materials." "That's accurate," Arjun said. "I want to be clear about why I am calling," Delvi Ron said. "I am not calling to make a legal demand or a threat. I am calling because I have been reviewing the timeline of events, and there is something I do not fully understand, and I would rather understand it." Arjun found this interesting. He sat down at the kitchen table. "What don't you understand?" "You are a combat medic with no background in interstellar law, GCA policy, or galactic affairs. You encountered a source who presented you with highly sensitive documents. You had 48 hours between receiving those documents and their publication." A pause. "Why did you act immediately? Many humans, when presented with information of this magnitude, require more time. They consult. They hesitate. They weigh the personal risk more carefully." Arjun looked at the kitchen counter at the spot where the starship drawing had been before he'd put it away. Rohan had made a new one since then. A fleet, actually. A whole page of small ships. "I had a son to worry about," he said. "He's 7. The question wasn't whether to act. The question was how to act fast enough. You did not consider that your intervention might fail, that the GCA's ability to manage the disclosure and discredit the source was significant." "Of course it might fail," Arjun said. "Most things might fail. The way I see it, failing while trying is a different kind of failure than not trying. The second kind is the one you can't come back from." A longer pause. "I see," said Delviron. "Can I ask you something?" "You may ask. Are you calling because you want to understand something? Or because someone told you to call, and you're trying to figure out whether this conversation is useful?" Another pause, shorter this time. "Both," said the assessor. "The two are not mutually exclusive." "Fair," said Arjun. "One more question," Delviron said. "The source. She chose you, a single father, a diner, after 11 months of observation." His secondary resonance dropped slightly, which Arjun was beginning to understand as a marker of something, not quite discomfort, not quite respect, but something between them. "In my 30 years of working GCA governance, I have observed that Ventari analysts who work extended assignments among provisional species sometimes develop what we refer to as assignment proximity effects. Increased empathy with the subject population, altered risk calculations, a tendency to overweight individual human actors relative to institutional forces." "And you think that's what happened with Jaya?" "I thought so initially. I am less certain now." Because she was right," said Delviron. "About you, about the publication, about the effect of making it public." A pause. "And because the risk calculations she made, which I initially characterized as proximity distorted, appear in retrospect to have been quite precise." Arjun said nothing. He let this sit. "She is a very good analyst," the assessor said, and there was something in the tone of it, the way the cello note shifted, that made Arjun think the words were costing something. "It is perhaps unfortunate that it took this particular sequence of events for that to be clearly on the record." "Yeah," said Arjun. "Maybe next time you could figure that out before someone has to risk everything to prove it." He expected a defensive response. What he got was a sound that he would later describe to Leela as something like a short exhalation, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh, but something that existed in the space between them. And then the assessor said, "Perhaps," in a tone that suggested the word was carrying more weight than its single syllable indicated. The call ended. Arjun sat at the kitchen table for a moment, looking at the fleet of starships on the counter. Then he made himself a cup of tea, because it was 7 in the morning and some things were invariable. Jaya came back to the diner on a Wednesday, which was off schedule and therefore notable. She sat in Arjun's booth because it was the booth she knew, and she ordered nothing because she was the one who usually did the ordering, and she sat with her hands flat on the table, not pressing them down to control them, just resting them there, easy and still. "I have been offered a position," she said. Arjun waited. "At the University of Bristol. They have a new interspecies relations research center, funded by a consortium of institutions that have been studying the convergence and its long-term social and political implications. They want a xenobiological analyst who has direct experience with GCA governance structures." She looked at the table. "The offer was, I believe, motivated at least in part by the fact that my name is currently attached to a significant piece of recent history, which creates a kind of interest in my perspective that I would not otherwise have generated." "Does that bother you?" She considered this seriously, the way she considered most things. "It would have bothered me before. I spent a great deal of my career trying to ensure that my work was evaluated on its own terms, without my name or my species or my institutional affiliations creating a lens that distorted the evaluation. And now I think I was evaluating the wrong thing. The work and the name and the affiliations and the choices, they are not separable. The work is what it is because of everything that shaped it, including the 3 years I spent in this diner listening to a man hum old film songs while he waited for his soup to cool." Arjun blinked. "You could hear that." Ventari hearing is approximately twice as sensitive as human hearing in the frequency ranges your humming occupies, she said, and the secondary resonance in her voice had something in it he was almost certain was amusement. You hum the same melody every Thursday. I do not know what it is. It's an old Telugu film, he said. Aditya 369. My mother used to watch it. I watched it with her when I was a kid. There's a song from it I've never been able to get out of my head. What is it about? Time travel, he said. Going back to the past and forward to the future. Trying to fix things you can't change and protect things that matter. She was quiet for a moment. That seems appropriate, she said. He thought about his mother watching that film in their living room in Hyderabad, the sound of it through the walls when he was supposed to be asleep. The melody that had lived in him for 30-odd years, without him ever consciously deciding to keep it. The way things stayed with you not because you held on to them, but because they had already become part of the structure of you, as quietly as bone. Are you going to take the position? He asked. I am deciding. She looked at the diner, at Marcus behind the counter, at the Thursday afternoon light coming through the windows, at the booth across the room where Arjun and Rohan always sat. There is a version of my future where I leave this and do the work I trained to do, in an institution that will give me the resources and the platform to do it well. She paused. There is another version where I stay here and observe humans at close range for another few years, because I am still not certain I understand you, and I am more convinced than I was before that understanding you is important. You could do both, Arjun said. Research doesn't have to happen in one place. No, she agreed, it doesn't. She looked at the table between them, at the empty space where the crystal and the chip had been, 8 months ago, in October light. What was it that made you certain, she asked, when I told you in this booth? You didn't hesitate long. He thought about this honestly. Rohan's drawing, he said finally. The little figures in the starship windows. He was putting people in it just instinctively because a ship isn't a ship without people in it, it's just a machine. And I looked at those little figures and I thought, whoever those people grow up to be, they're going to live in a world that was decided for them tonight, or they're going to live in a world that someone decided to fight for tonight. And the deciding is always someone specific, in a specific moment. It doesn't happen abstractly. Jaya was quiet. My species has a concept, she said after a moment. There is no precise translation into English. It describes the quality of a moment in which a decision becomes inevitable, not because the circumstances force it, but because the person inside the circumstances has become, through the accumulation of everything they are, exactly the kind of person for whom there was never really a choice. The word carries the sense of recognition rather than compulsion. You recognize that you have already become the person who does this thing. The doing of it is almost a formality. Arjun turned this over. What's the word? He asked. She said it, a Venthari word, double-toned, the lower resonance carrying as much information as the upper, a sound that had no English analog and couldn't really be written in Roman characters, but sat in the air between them with a completeness that made him understand. For a moment, that language was not a limitation so much as a frontier. Every language drew the edge of what its speakers could think precisely. Every new word from another tongue was a new room. Yeah, he said, I think I understand that. I thought you might, she said. Marcus came by with a pot of coffee and looked at the two of them with the incurious warmth of someone who had worked behind a counter long enough to recognize that the specific contents of other people's conversations were their own business. He refilled Arjun's mug without being asked, as he always did, and moved on. Rohan came home from school on a Thursday in what would have been the 14th month, the month the reclassification had been scheduled to take effect, with a drawing he'd made in art class. He showed it to Arjun at the kitchen table that evening, holding it up with both hands. It was a planet. He'd done it in blue and green and brown, the colors not quite accurate to any planet Arjun could identify, but clearly meant as a planet, round and full, with a line of stars around it and several small objects that might have been ships or might have been birds. It was sometimes hard to tell with Rohan. Around the planet he had written, in his careful, improving handwriting, the names of species: Ventari, Threnchi, Velari, Crethan, humans. 6 or 7 others he had spelled phonetically from however he'd encountered them, which produced some creative variations. Below the planet he had written, everyone. "What's it for?" Arjun asked. "Just because," Rohan said. "I wanted to draw everyone together." Arjun looked at it for a long moment. The planet, the ships or birds, the names arranged in a circle like a list that had no beginning and no end. "It's good," he said. "Can I show Jaya on Tuesday?" "Yeah," Arjun said. "She'll like it." Rohan put the drawing on the counter and went to get his homework, and Arjun stood in the kitchen in the Thursday evening light and thought about the geometry of small things. A drawing, a cup, a table in a corner. A woman's hands trembling over chocolate milk. The future arrived not in the shape of great events, but in the shape of moments that no one documented except the people inside them. The moments that looked, from the outside, like nothing at all. He put the kettle on, because it was Thursday and some things were invariable. Outside the window, the street was doing what streets did. Continuing.